Israel's military assault on Gaza in the summer of 2014 resulted in the death of over 2,000 Palestinians, a quarter of whom were children. This was the sixth Israeli military offensive in the last 8 years. In fact, since the year 2000, Israeli forces have killed over 1,900 Palestinian children alone. This is a full generation of young Palestinians who've been enduring occupation, economic blockades, and the horrific experiences of war. We often wonder how the world allows such oppression to keep repeating itself. Our speakers today are intensely involved in current international efforts calling for justice and accountability and for the end of the impunity that Israel seems to enjoy. We're very, very fortunate to have with us Nadia Ben-Youssef and Brad Parker, who have most recently been working with the United Nations Independent Commission of Inquiry on the 2014 Gaza war. They will explain and give us an update on this commission of inquiry. They will also discuss child's rights and other violations and talk about the challenges of international advocacy strategies that call for Israel's accountability for its military offensive in Gaza and its devastating consequences. I'll introduce both speakers and then ask them to speak, and then after we're done, we'll open the floor for discussion. Those of you who are online can tweet your questions. Our handle is @Palestine Center. Nadia Ben-Youssef is a lawyer and human rights advocate, serving as the first USA representative of Adalah, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel. Her work aims to raise awareness of the institutional discrimination against Palestinian citizens in Israel, as well as promote compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law. After 4 years in the Negev in southern Israel, leading Adalah's international advocacy efforts on behalf of the Bedouin community, she's now developing Adalah's U.S. advocacy strategy to shape American discourse and influence policy toward a human rights-based approach in Israel-Palestine. She holds a BA in sociology from Princeton and a JD from Boston College of Law. Just a quick introduction of Adalah, which is Nadia's organization. It's a legal center and an independent human rights organization based in Israel. It was established in 1996. Adalah uses Israeli legal channels to protect and promote the right of Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, who make up 20% of the population, as well as the Palestinian residents of the occupied Palestinian territory. The organization regularly brings cases to the Israeli Supreme Court and also engages in international advocacy at the UN, the EU, and recently in the United States. Brad Parker is a staff attorney and international advocacy officer at Defense for Children International Palestine, DCIP. He specializes in issues of juvenile justice and grave violations against children during armed conflict, and he leads DCIP's legal advocacy efforts on Palestinian children's rights. Brad regularly writes and speaks on the situation of Palestinian children in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly issues involving detention, ill treatment, and torture of child detainees within the Israeli military detention system, and violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. He leads DCIP's U.S. program. Brad is a graduate of the University of Vermont and received his JD from the City University of New York School of Law. His organization, Defense for Children International Palestine, is an independent local Palestinian child's rights organization based in Ramallah. It's dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of children living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. For over 20 years, DCI Palestine has investigated, documented, and pursued accountability for serious human rights violations against children, held Israeli and Palestinian authorities accountable to universal human rights principles, and advocated at the international and national levels to advance access to justice and protection for children. DCI Palestine also provides direct legal aid to children in distress. We'll ask Nadia and Brad to speak, then take questions. I think Brad will go first. Welcome again. Thank you.
See. So, thank you for welcoming us and into your space. It's nice that you're all here in person to talk with us. Welcome everybody that's watching on the internet. What we're trying to do today is talk about some of our work and put it into context of things that you may understand, you may know from following the situation in Israel-Palestine recently over the past year or say, and try to really focus in on where we go from here as both Americans, as attorneys, as a child rights advocate, as a discrimination expert, right? I mean, what do we do as individuals and how do we move things forward? I'll start talking a little bit about the context of violations, particularly focused on children's rights in Gaza over the past several years, and repeated military offensives that have taken place, and then move into a few specific cases from the most recent offensive, and then we'll talk a little bit about the investigations, domestic accountability measures that exist in some form. Nadia will speak about that, and then I'll come back and speak a little bit more about international accountability mechanisms, some of the strategies that we're using as a local Palestinian human rights organization on the international level, and what we think about some of the recent developments over the past few months. So that's a brief little timeline. We want you to be engaged, so we're going to save hopefully 25-30 minutes for questions, so please ask questions. I think that's for us, we have a lot of information, a lot of specific information, and sometimes us just talking isn't the best way to access that. So if you have questions, please write them down, keep them, and we'll address them to our best ability towards the end. Child rights, Palestinian children's rights. It's not a good situation, and that is kind of the biggest understatement I could say. Palestinian children, since the beginning of the occupation, have really been forced to bear the brunt of a lot of the discrimination, a lot of the violence, a lot of the military offensives that have occurred throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. Recently, the more high-profile violence is obviously in Gaza, but Palestinian children throughout the occupied Palestinian territory are subject to violence, subject to oppression, human rights violations related to the occupation. So I think we always try to start our presentations, our briefings. The occupation is the frame for these violations. The occupation allows these violations to take place. They create the infrastructure, the military infrastructure, the military weapons, the military personnel that interact with these kids throughout the West Bank, throughout East Jerusalem, and in Gaza. So when we talk about the occupation, the other piece of it is the systematic impunity that goes with it, the lack of accountability, and the failure of not just the Israeli authorities to investigate allegations of war crimes, human rights violations, child rights violations, right? It's the international community's failure as well, and that's something that we'll talk about towards the end. But I think the occupation allows this to continue, and the impunity allows this to continue. So Gaza. Gaza currently is in its 8th year of an Israeli-imposed blockade. We have guests here that can talk in detail about the humanitarian aspects and what that means, not just for children, but also for men, women, children, everybody living in Gaza. I won't focus on reconstruction. I won't focus on the humanitarian aspects so much. because I really want to focus on the specific violations that are tied to the accountability measures at the international level that we try to narrow in on today. But generally, the population in Gaza is extremely young. Around 43% of kids, or the entire population, is under the age of 14. Around 52% of the population is under 18. In the past, since 2006, there's been 6 military offensives on Gaza, right? There's been 3 major ones. Operation Cast-Lead in December 2008, January 2009 was the, you could say, the first, not the first, the most recent upsurge in widespread devastation through a military offensive on Gaza. There's 353 children that were killed in attacks on Gaza. That was a 22-day offensive. In November 2012, it was kind of the second major Israeli military operation on Gaza. It's called Operation Pillar of Defense. It lasted for just 8 days. I think there was 34 children killed in Israeli attacks. And following Cast-Lead, which I think everybody sort of knows, at least in the US, there was an upsurge in organizing and awareness around Palestinian rights because of what was being seen on the news from the Israeli military violence in Gaza. In November 2012, you saw a little bit more awareness, more people talking about it, but still there was a real lack of any leadership to address not only of violations, but the root causes of the violations, which go back to the closure of Gaza, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So I'm going to talk about the most recent offensive, but it's hard to kind of get past the context of the impunity that just continues year after year. So Cast-Lead was something new in the sense that the violations were so widespread. The targeting of residential neighborhoods, civilian homes, really anything could be a target. In the result of that is that children are killed in their homes, they're killed in their neighborhoods, they're killed with their families. In the most recent military offensive in July and August of 2014, this was overwhelmingly the case. Operation Protective Edge, which was the Israeli name given to the military operation, killed 547 children. So Cast-Lead sort of set the high watermark for the level of violence, the types of violence. In last summer, really was unprecedented levels. We have numerous different types of weapons. You have kids killed in their homes from 2,000-pound warplane bombs, entire families. On July 20th, the Abu Jamia family, a bomb dropped on their home. 27 members of the family were killed, 18 children, right? And that happened throughout Gaza. Really, there was no safe place for children. One of the key trends that we've pulled out of our documentation, and I'll share. So we just published a new report, and it's available on our website. It's dci-palestine.org. And in it, it goes through the child fatalities that occurred during Operation Protective Edge. And what we pulled out from there is we have 547 children killed as a total. 535 were killed as a result of direct Israeli attacks. 225 kids were killed in airstrikes. 164 kids were killed in drone strikes. These are, I mean, the increasing use of drones in Gaza is something that is extremely troubling. You have drones being used in a highly urban setting with extreme technical capacities to identify targets, and yet you still have children out in the open, 4 or 5 years old, during daylight hours, being struck directly with weaponized drones. These are international humanitarian law violations. Key piece of attacks in Gaza and conducting military operations generally, right? Civilians cannot be targeted. Aside from the issue of homes belonging to a suspected Hamas member, say, we have dozens and dozens of cases of children directly targeted. I think the key, kind of the emblematic case that was a very high-profile case last summer was the case of the 4 boys that were killed on Gaza Beach. There's 4 boys playing soccer. There was an initial strike that targeted a building where one of the boys was fetching a soccer ball. The strike hit, killed the first child, and then as the other boys ran down the beach towards a nearby cafeteria or hotel, they were struck again with a second strike. The 4 of them were killed. 4 other children were seriously injured. And we have dozens of these cases where there is no military activity in the area. Often there's no adults visible or in the area, yet there's drone strikes, there's artillery shelling, military conduct that violates international law, violates international humanitarian law, and likely amounts to war crimes. These violations have happened before. The scale and intensity seems to be increasing. When I mentioned drone strikes, we've seen the increasing use of drones for surveillance capabilities. In November 2012, we saw an increased use of drones for targeting individuals, homes, etc. 164 kids killed in drone strikes during the 50-day offensive last summer is unprecedented, right? I think with the capabilities that drones have, and the Israeli military will say, so when we challenge a strike and we say that this is a violation of international humanitarian law, possibly a war crime, the one challenge that we receive back is that our drone capabilities, we have such high level of technical ability, we can locate targets, we can identify those targets, we know what they are. It doesn't work and it doesn't correspond with the information we have. The only way to reconcile those drone technologies with the facts that we document as an organization and that other organizations document is that there's direct targeting of children. There's really no way around it. Yet, there's still structural impunity for these violations. And I think I'll stop briefly there. I'll turn it over to talk about the domestic piece, and then we'll come back and kind of talk about a little bit more how these violations play out at the international level.
Thanks so much, Brad. Thank you to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center for hosting us. It's actually quite difficult to start after that, Brad. And as I was just even writing down those figures, this is new information about the drone strikes, about the children who are killed in homes. The numbers are disturbing, to say the least. As much as we become a bit desensitized to it, I think just to hold that, and not the number necessarily, but the lives that we're talking about. And I think that's critical for human rights advocates to keep in mind. These are lives, they're numbers, and we can reduce them to numbers, but in some way that feels very crude and difficult. So I will speak a bit about what we're trying to do as lawyers, as a human rights organization, and where we've come in the last 6 years. As Brad said, we have a lot of experience with this. This is the last, and as Zaina and Brad both said, 6 offensives since the since the siege, since the closure. 3 in the last 6 years. We have colleagues in Gaza who has twins who are 7 years old, and so this is the 3rd military offensive that they've seen in their lives, and I think that's really important. I'm going to talk a bit about international efforts to secure accountability, but primarily about what Adalah does, which is, as a legal center based in Israel, we use domestic legal channels. We're using the Israeli legal mechanisms, domestic mechanisms that exist, and trying, even though we know from experience that accountability is very difficult to achieve, using those and exposing, revealing the flaws of the system that, in the end, advocacy takes on. Advocacy takes that on, and communities take that on. So we'll discuss the failures of domestic mechanisms of accountability. I can speak a bit too about where we are now with regard to the Commission of Inquiry internationally, though Brad, I think, will take us into that direction. And as we walk through the efforts that we've made as a legal center, engaging with the international community, I'm also interested in your feedback and the very legitimate question of why are we engaging? Why continue to engage when you know that accountability domestically is not possible? So I want to just briefly, and I'm sure that I'm speaking in many ways to people who know these issues, but just briefly take us through what happened over the last 6 years and how we've engaged and the lessons that we've learned. So after Operation Cast Lead, there was something called the Goldstone Commission. So this was a commission, a fact-finding mechanism that came out of the UN Human Rights Council. And that mission, the Goldstone Mission, concluded that there are serious doubts about the willingness of Israel to carry out genuine investigations in accordance with international law. That was a conclusion. They said, in fact, it looks inherently discriminatory. It looks inherently discriminatory, the way that, or the blocking of the pursuit of justice for Palestinians. And I think what's maybe even more interesting, or it kind of brings us to the present day, there was a follow-up mission to Goldstone. And if you followed a bit of that, there was a follow-up mechanism where they were looking at, okay, so there are flaws in the system, but what has happened in the interim? So they looked at, after Goldstone, was there a change? We told you that there were serious doubts. What did Israel do about that? And this follow-up mechanism, which is actually led by Mary McGowan Davis, who's now leading the Commission of Inquiry on Gaza. She's a Supreme Court justice from New York. So she looked at that and she said that the demonstrated practice of opening only a small percentage of investigations cast doubt on the impartiality of the system. What does that mean? And we were speaking with colleagues from UNRWA a bit about this too, that in Operation Cast Lead, 400 investigations were initiated, right? So 400 incidents, were examined. 52 were investigated. There were 3 indictments. You heard the figures from Brad, particularly with regard to children. 1,400 people were killed, 353 children were killed in Operation Cast Lead. 3 indictments, and the most severe punishment was for credit card theft. The most severe punishment was for credit card theft. So when the follow-up mechanism to Goldstone looked at this, they said, something is wrong. Something is wrong. There was a recent article in Haaretz where the military advocate general and the chief prosecutor of the military answered this question, answered this critique, and said, we don't look at statistics. We don't look at those figures. They're meaningless to us. If we do the investigation, that's fine. We don't buy this idea that out of 1,400 people who were killed, 3 indictments, and the most severe punishment is credit card theft. We don't think that that matters. The international community would say, and I think all of us would say that it does. After Goldstone, and after, if you remember in 2010, the Freedom Flotilla, attempting to break the siege on Gaza, 9 Turkish activists were killed. Through international pressure, the Israeli government appointed the Turkle Commission to investigate again, see if there's ways that we can improve investigative mechanisms. The conclusion of the Turkle report was that, in fact, everything's in conformity with international law. Everything's in conformity with international law, but we recommend 18 major changes major changes in order to address some of the flaws. Their flaws, it's still in compliance with international law. One of those suggestions was a fact-finding assessment mechanism, which I'll speak about briefly. But it failed to recognize what I think is really important with regard to Israeli domestic mechanisms of accountability is the dual role played by the military advocate general. So the military advocate general offers advice during the operation, so offers legal advice during the operation, and is also responsible for deciding whether or not to investigate itself. It gives legal advice about the legitimacy of the target, and it's responsible for investigating itself. This is called a dual role in international criminal law and international humanitarian law. This is very problematic. It deals with issues of independence and impartiality to properly investigate itself. So Turkle didn't address that. They didn't address when you should be investigating at all. What are the circumstances where you would investigate an allegation of a war crime? They were supposed to follow up in October of 2014, no follow-up. They were supposed to follow up in December of 2014, no follow-up. But Brad and I just came out of a long delegation at the UN, particularly around what was this commission of inquiry, which was supposed to give its report in March, but is now going to deliver its report in June. And as we were there, the biggest block we found in briefings with diplomatic missions was that they said, listen, we spoke with the Israelis. There is a new fact-finding assessment mechanism, and we know that they're using that, and we know that they're now investigating themselves, so come back later. We know that this is being taken care of. And in fact, Israel is promoting this wildly, saying, we have a fact-finding assessment mechanism. This is a new strategy. It came out of Turkle. We listen to the international community. We want to make sure that our investigations comply with international law. And this fact-finding assessment mechanism was established in September of 2014, so right after the war. What is this fact-finding assessment mechanism? One of the reasons, and it goes to the question that I said I welcome you to ask about why we continue to engage in this situation, is because we're testing that mechanism. Adalah is engaging with that mechanism. So after the war and during the war, during and in the immediate aftermath of the war, Adalah, together with our Palestinian partners living in Gaza, so Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, Al-Haq, also DCI, we take those cases and we use the mechanisms that exist. We work with the military advocate general. And I want to flag that that's different. That's a different strategy than some of the Israeli human rights organizations. B'Tselem and Yashdin issued a very public, very powerful statement during the war that said, we refuse. We refuse to engage with the military advocate general because it's whitewashing. So why are Palestinian human rights organizations still engaging? One is to test it. Because in the international community, they'll say, we have a new mechanism. We have a new mechanism and maybe it's working. And we can tell you that it's not working. So Adalah submitted to the military advocate general 11 cases covering about 20 incidents. These are direct targeting of civilian homes. This is the targeting of schools and hospitals, of civilian infrastructure, water, electricity. We are following these particular cases together with our partners in Gaza. 2 have been opened, and as Brad mentioned, I'm sure if you followed the war, you know which ones we're talking about, which 2 were opened. The killing of the boys on Gaza Beach and the attacks on UNRWA schools. So UNRWA is also working to do its own investigations. And so there was a lot of attention. There was a ton of international attention on these 2 cases. And so we expected that those would be opened, and those were opened. Others that were closed, the bombing of the Al-Kuwari family. 8 people, including 6 children, were killed in that attack, 25 injured. When we are engaging with the military advocate general and the fact-finding assessment mechanism, and I'll tell you a bit more before I let Brad kind of take us further, is they'll say very abruptly, this was used as a military purpose. This was used as a military target. So That's all we have to say about that. The level of transparency, the level of information that advocates have, that victims have to why they were targeted is incredibly limited. The bombing of a journalist's car, 9 July 2014, 8 journalists were killed. In the response to that case, the military advocate general said at some point during the day the car was used to deliver weapons. They closed a case of a targeting of a shelter for disabled women, closed cases, targeting of hospitals, saying that they were used as military purposes. The cases are being closed. The cases are being closed. The law is failing Palestinians. And I will say that the fact-finding assessment mechanism and what we were reiterating in Geneva and as we continued with this European advocacy is that the fact-finding assessment mechanism is still within the hierarchy of the military. So the way that it works is that the military advocate general receives the complaints and sends them to the fact-finding assessment mechanism to say, see if there's an exceptional circumstance here. And that's an interesting legal, non-legal requirement, exceptional circumstance. And then the fact-finding assessment mechanism will go back to the military advocate general and say, this is my recommendation. And more often than not, the case is closed. So the fact-finding assessment mechanism, it must be reiterated, is not independent, is not impartial, still fails to comply with international law, despite what Israel is quite excited about. And I will just also say 2 quick updates so that you are with us as far as where we are domestically. There have been 2 really important cases from the Israeli Supreme Court that are essentially shutting down the possibility of seeking accountability through the courts as well. So in December of 2014, the Supreme Court dismissed a petition and upheld the policy of preventing residents from Gaza who have submitted complaints to the Israeli military from entering Israel to attend their own court hearings. So there's a number of requirements, regulations. For example, there's high financial guarantees, upwards of from $7,000 to $300,000 to guarantee that case. There's obviously a very strict timeline from when you can file. And most importantly is the siege, the closure of Gaza, that makes it impossible for people to enter into Israel to challenge then the injuries and damages inflicted by the military. The court upheld those regulations, dismissed that case in December 2014, essentially closing the door for civil accountability. Criminal accountability, you have a similar case in December of 2011, where after one of these offensives, actually in 2004, there was extensive damage to homes then, and Palestinian civil society approached the Israeli Supreme Court demanding the opening of criminal investigations. And the Supreme Court, interestingly, said, intervention in the professional decisions of the chief military prosecutor is rare and should only occur in very exceptional circumstances. The court is unwilling to intervene. Domestic legal mechanisms and legal avenues for accountability are closed. And so as Adalah continues to engage, and maybe we can speak about this later, we're very cognizant that the law itself is not the answer. The law itself is not the answer. In the absence of political will, this will continue. Accountability will not be secured, and therefore repetition is ensured. We were in Geneva, and the best that we could get out of our counterparts as we were discussing these violations was advice for the next war. Here's some advice for the next war. This is how you should better prepare. This is how you can come back to us and maybe achieve a different result. And beyond being an incredibly dehumanizing piece of advice, I think it also draws attention to our responsibility here and why the U.S. engagement is so important, why international engagement is so important. And so I'll leave that to Brad to discuss. Thank you.
So I work for a local Palestinian human rights organization. We focus specifically on children's rights. The domestic investigations, the domestic accountability measures fail without a doubt. So what do? Right? The strategy, sadly, for the past decade has been Palestinian human rights organizations looking to the international community to validate, to investigate, to hold perpetrators accountable. On the accountability front, things are pretty bleak. They've been bleak for a while. There's really been no accountability. And that's part of the reason why you have these continuing, repeated military offensives that are shocking, should be shocking to everyone. But you have no leadership from the US, from other powerful European states, and we constantly confront the sort of unwillingness to move things forward. We'll sit in meetings with representatives from, just say, powerful member states, and they tell us that they just can't do anything, and we look back at them kind of exasperated over and over again because they're the ones who can do something. It's their job to do something. Universal human rights law, international humanitarian law that they've obligated themselves to requires them to do something. But constantly we're up against these states refusing to hold people accountable. Let alone hold people accountable, just investigate or demand that there be credible, independent investigations. So right now, following Operation Protective Edge, there's a few doors that are new. They've been cracked open, and so it feels like a shift in the accountability landscape. It's probably not that hopeful, to be honest. It probably isn't going to result in accountability. It's definitely not going to result in comprehensive justice or accountability that would kind of move things into a better situation where military offensives, the oppression, the discrimination as part of the occupation would be stopped. But there's an opportunity. So first is the Commission of Inquiry on the Gaza conflict that was set up by the Human Rights Council last July in a special session by the UN Human Rights Council. And they were tasked with looking into the international humanitarian law violations that occurred related to the offensive on Gaza. Just briefly, it's sort of been a rocky road for them. Aside from staffing issues and funding issues, one of the three commissioners was resigned a few months ago. That set them back a bit. The resignation happened in part due to Israeli pressure and focus on kind of working to delegitimize the mandate of the Commission of Inquiry. So we find ourselves in March at the Human Rights Council, and the Commission of Inquiry was supposed to present the report. We probably can assume that there'll be findings of international humanitarian law violations on a case-by-case basis, investigating kind of the more high-profile, the more egregious cases that are emblematic of the offensive overall. But it won't be a comprehensive report. The commissioners asked for more time. It was granted. Now it's postponed till June. What does that mean? We had lots of discussions around this about, should we support the additional time? Should we, be critical of that additional postponement being granted? Should we, come out against the commission strongly and say they need to do this? What are we doing? And we essentially said, we don't know. We know what they're going to find. It doesn't help to pressure them. Let them do their work. We know what it's going to be. And it's more important that it's credible, that there's buy-in from member states, and now we have time to work educating member states on why they need to actually be leaders and do something, even if it's just supporting the findings of this report. It's been slow going. We have a few more weeks, we'll see, but it feels very much like the same story. the same thing is happening that happened previously. Not only do violations continue in Gaza, but then you have this charade afterwards that continues as well. And it's basically the international community in some way either actively shielding Israeli officials, Israeli commanders from accountability, or just not doing anything to stop it or address it. One thing, I know we're running out of time, so I just want to address the ICC issue quick, and then the U.S. role in a broader context. So the ICC, we've been hearing a long time from Palestinian leadership that they're going to the ICC. Palestinian organizations, Palestinian civil society, I think, was growing extremely impatient because I think at every turn, justice and accountability is denied for violations that are just kind of ongoing, consistent. They flare up, yes, in military offensives, but really the occupation continues to devastate and oppress people. And so there is a desire to even if it's symbolic, to push forward, to do something different. The ICC was always pushed or presented as sort of, the last gasp. It's the thing that we have in our pocket that we can use when we really, really need to. And the timing has to be right. So that's done, right? We're there. The State of Palestine submitted Article 12.3 declaration to the ICC. So the ICC has started a preliminary examination into the situation of Palestine. That door is wide open. It's moving forward. I think the critique needs to be that it's not comprehensive, that it's not going to address the conflict. It's not very forward-looking at all. It doesn't solve the root causes of the occupation. Yes, there may be accountability. There may be individual criminal responsibility for past violations, but it's not a tool that addresses the occupation, the future, the settlement industry. It's not a silver bullet. But we're pursuing it. We're working with it. And hopefully we'll have updates. But it really takes a movement. I mean, these legal tools, and Nadia mentioned it perfectly, these legal tools really are nothing if they're not connected to a movement. DCI Palestine, Adalah, were both representatives based in the U.S., particularly to conduct outreach, education, work with local organizations, local groups, individuals sometimes, on organizing their families, their communities, right, to do something. Because it really takes a movement combined with lawyers, combined with media, combined with kind of everything you can muster, to force our leaders to really do something different. Because the status quo, I think, it's not working. It hasn't worked. It's been obvious, I think, to some of us for a long time. It's not a secret. And we know what's coming next if we don't address this. And it's repeated military offensives in Gaza and continued devastation of Palestinian lives throughout the occupied Palestinian territory. So we'll stop, and maybe we have some time for questions.
Military follows any specific guidelines in the arresting and imprisonment of children? I mean, they have their law in Israel. Do they apply it to Palestinians? And if not, then is there a set of guidelines?
Should we take a few questions and then
Would
answer?
you like to do that?
Maybe so
Yeah.
we can get a few.
Okay,
What do you think?
we'll take a
Yeah.
couple of more questions and then they can do the answers. Yes, Pam.
I think many people think that all of war is a crime. I would like to know how you define a war crime. I mean, I understand the bombing of the children on the beach, the UNRWA schools, but when you get into the bombing, how is it different from the bombing of Baghdad that we did, or Dresden, or, the bombing in general of civilian populations? How do you make that distinction of a war crime?
So
There's one at the very end. We'll just take one more, and then maybe the two of you could answer the questions.
Thank you. Nadia, the question is the committee that was established in the wake of the Turkle Commission that was supposed to issue recommendations again in October, is that still pending? Is it still something that we're hoping for some sort of output from?
Great. Okay.
So, I think it's working. So for the first question, so you have the occupied Palestinian territory, right, West Bank, and you have Israel. In 1967, Israeli forces occupied the West Bank. When they did so, they instituted military law. So it's a military law framework that exists in the West Bank.
So there's no age?
There's, yes. So in the military law, the age of criminal responsibility is 12. And a child is now defined as anyone under 16 or under 18. It used to be 16 is the age of majority. That's changed. So you have two dual systems, right? And the military law framework is the legal framework that exists when you're talking about the West Bank for Palestinians. Even though military law applies throughout the entire West Bank, it applies to any person located in that territory. It's only applied to Palestinians. So if you're an Israeli citizen, an Israeli settler living in the West Bank, you have the benefit of Israeli civilian law, not military law. Civilian law has increased protections. It's similar to what we would expect for protections in the U.S. Obviously, there's differences in how it's applied internally within Israel, and Nadia can speak more about that. But the quick answer is it's two separate frameworks, two separate legal systems. Military law has very low protections for children. Ill treatment.
So do they get an advocate?
Good question. So there's, so we represent kids charged in Israeli military courts. Kids rarely have access to an attorney prior to an interrogation. Really, they don't have access to an attorney until they show up in a military court, which is 24 or 48 hours after an arrest. By that time, they're usually interrogated. They have a confession, something that's used against them to charge in the military court.
Are they subject to the same administrative detention as adults? They could be held.
Under the law, yes, but in practice, there hasn't been a child in administrative detention in the past 2 years or so. But I'd also like to make a plug because I presented on child detention here at the Palestine Center back in 2013, and there's a briefing that's on video that I think will be excellent for you to watch. But excellent questions. And so, war crimes. I mean, this is the nasty piece about the work that I do, that we do. We're constantly, our perspective and our frame is the law. And so, generally, we operate with a perspective of human rights law, which is more encompassing, stronger standards that universally apply. International humanitarian law, which governs armed conflict, which is what you have when you have a military offensive, isn't intended to be universal, right? In the sense that it protects all these rights at all times. It's meant to regulate war. So there's an inherent conflict between human rights law and humanitarian law. And so your question is, it's a struggle internally that I feel all the time. And I know there's people in the room that can really speak in more detail about that tension. But to focus on your question, I mean, we use international humanitarian law. That sets the framework for what is a war crime. Principle of distinction, right? You can't target civilians. Civilians are protected. Children are protected under humanitarian law. They need to be kept outside of hostilities. You need to take precaution in attack. If you know that a home has 28 civilians in it, and potentially there's a military target in there, if it's a civilian home, it's presumed to be a civilian target that can't be attacked. You have to know specifically that is a military target, And then even if it is a military target that's subject to an attack, the attack has to be proportionate, right? And that's a tricky standard. There's different interpretations. You know, is killing 28 people in a home to kill one person that's affiliated with Hamas, is that disproportionate? We say yes. We say, you know, if he's a Hamas policeman, he's not even a military target, right? If he's a Palestinian fighter, maybe he is, but that's not a proportionate attack, right? And so you get into kind of a much deeper analysis. And this is what I think is interesting when it comes to the ICC, because these are the questions that they'll be looking at. They're looking at right now. And I think the indiscriminate nature of attacks is more clear than some of the disproportionate pieces of their attacks. But you know, when you try to compare what happened in Gaza to, say, World War II carpet bombing, and you know, those should be violations too. IHL evolves over time, and that's something that the Israeli government is also very conscious of. And what you see in Gaza is new justifications in sort of the guise of the war on terror, right? You don't see people talking about military targets. They're terrorist targets. They killed terrorists. They didn't kill fighters or soldiers. And that language is all being used to really create new arguments where, you know, Hamas controls Gaza. Therefore, Hamas and Gaza and everybody there are legitimate targets under international law. And that's the key piece. I mean, that's the thing that, that's why you have these violations. That's why you have this immense scale of violence, is because it's a shifting frame, at least on the Israeli side, of what IHL means and what they're bound to. But
Right. And yeah, I mean, I think as lawyers, this is the framework that you're working in. That's a troubling framework. There was also, and it's open to manipulation. So one of a great article that came out during the war was by an Israeli human rights lawyer named Michael Svard. And in Haaretz, he wrote, the title of the piece was "The Targeted Assassination of International Law." So noticing that it can be manipulated, absolutely, and we have to watch that. So civilian, for example, the idea of civilians became so much beyond what we could imagine, that all of the targets that Brad was discussing were legitimate or perceived to be legitimate through the eyes of the Israeli military. So the law is, again, alone is not the answer, because it can be manipulated in this way. So with Mike, we're waiting for it and following it. So yes, the delay from October to December was announced, was public, and so we're anticipating it. You had various justifications for the delay, including the Israeli elections, and I would also just flag that as an interesting piece to see what happens. The government needs to be formed by May 6th, and at that point you'll have the platform of the government that'll lay out also intentions with regard to investigations, potentially. So the Turkle Committee and the follow-up committee to Turkle are on our agenda, and we're following that closely.
I'm Lowell Christie from the Cultural Strategies Institute. I'm incredibly depressed. What I'm hearing from you is, when you're describing your organizations, is that you follow. Last week there was a conference on the Israeli lobby at the National Press Club, highly impressive, but the characterization was it was reactive. And my question is, where's the strategy? I see tactics, I see response to actions, but it's like domestic abuse. Well, we can't do anything until he kills you. And so I'm asking, where are the strategies if indeed the United Nations, the meta-organizational structures are not working, the local operations, interactions are not working? Where are the strategies that happen in the mezzo, in the in-between? I'm not hearing that, and I'm depressed.
Oh no.
sorry, we're depressed.
No, I'm going to say yes. But Lowell, I want you to leave with hopefulness because, and I hope that you do. I hope that you do, and I hope that you all do because there is hope. There's movement on the ground. There's an amazing movement that is growing, that has been growing for years, that is reaching really interesting levels and is thinking strategically. The Palestinian organizations were in, yes, we've tried to do, for example, strategic plans. And then you have a war and you have elections and your strategic plans fall apart. We are reactive, we recognize that, and we're working to be more strategic. But even as we do impact litigation, which is the strategic piece of our work, it's contextual and it depends on what happens around the region and in our area. So in some ways we can't help but be responsive, but what's strategic is the movement building that's happening now. And I think that's what we should pay attention to and what we should draw inspiration from. So when I left UN and the EU, I came almost running back to the United States with energy. I was like, this is where it's happening. This growth and this movement is hopeful. You were at the Israeli lobby, you're right, it was impressive. I followed it online. The student movement is impressive. What's happening among civil society in this country is impressive. I think what's best too is the transnational movement that's growing. So what matters in Palestine matters here. What's happening here is mattering to Palestinians. There's an intersectional, transnational movement against systems of oppression that are targeting the root causes of these issues. And I think that's what's inspiring because you're at the decision-making level talking about crumbs, talking about access for the Commission of Inquiry, talking about one small attack, when in the end you want to talk about the occupation, in the end you want to talk about accountability, you want to talk about equal rights, and the movement allows us to have that conversation. And I think that's where we need to focus, and I think that's where I find hope. It's where I hope you find hope, and I would encourage us all to be involved in that, to be watching that, and I think that's where the change is happening. It's why we can wake up every morning in spite of this really, really devastating reality. People are demanding change and demanding it in really unique ways, and I am hopeful. So I'm sorry for what we gave you, the background that we gave you, but leave with hope and leave with energy because it also demands your engagement in this, all of our engagement in this.
Yeah. And I'd say that, I mean, we focused on Gaza specifically, so that the strategy piece is kind of outside of that. But the fact that we're both here in the U.S. is evidence of the strategy that we have and how the movement building piece is so critical when the international piece is a failure, essentially, or an obstacle to justice and accountability. So, I think we've gotten everything we can, in some ways, from the the UN human rights mechanisms say. We have extremely strong language, repeatedly, but it doesn't change policy. And really, I think over the past few years, I think it started with in the aftermath of CASLED, particularly in the U.S., on campuses. There was mobilization around Palestinian rights, saying we don't want to support Israeli policies with our government money, our government weapons, our policymakers, if they're doing these things. And that was really kind of a change from my perspective in how people engaged. I mean, back 2006, 2007, you say Palestine outside, I'm from New York. It's not, I looked around, I didn't say it, I censored myself. And I think the fact that we have come a long way, there's a lot farther to go, I think, but the one thing that keeps me energized and hopeful is that we are tapped in with the movements here in the U.S., and they are changing things. I think the faith-based community and the moves within the churches for awareness, but also divestment. I mean, it's a huge.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a huge shift.
Jewish Voice for Peace.
And it's growing, I think, daily. And it's an important piece to watch because when things were happening last summer and Gaza was being bombed, what we saw from that was a complete generational split. 30 and under saw it as a human rights issue, right? A human rights perspective, which is what we do. That's how we present issues. We use the law-based human rights perspective. Everybody's entitled to these rights are being denied, that's a problem. Where 30 and above, say, 40 and above, see it through the kind of traditional American political lens, where human rights are not relevant, violations of human rights aren't relevant, violations of humanitarian law aren't relevant, because it's a political issue, right? There's a conflict, there's leaders, they're at loggerheads. That's it. You know, maybe we can solve it, maybe we can't. In that perspective, it's irrelevant in a way. I mean, we're fighting against it in a lot of our work, but when we see the mobilization with the younger crowd, what's happening on campuses, what's happening with the movement building, we know that that perspective is disappearing. It's not happening fast enough. You know, on a pure kind of organic level, I think we're still a long ways off from having that translate into policy changes, but we need to support that movement and move it forward and do everything that we can. And that's why we're here in the U.S. for, you know,
Better or for worse.
so hopefully you feel a little bit better now.
We have time for one more question. Okay, thanks so much for that presentation. Noura Erakat with Adalah and George Mason University. I wanted to definitely affirm what you're saying about movement, but insist that, in fact, that the politics and the human rights law aren't as distinct, but as you articulated earlier, that, you know, oftentimes law is an extension of politics. And so in reference to the question about the violations, the manipulation of law, I think it's really scary that what Israel was doing was expanding the definition of legitimate civilians and legitimate civilian infrastructure in ways that completely turned humanitarian law on its head, which can either be seen as manipulation or evolution, depending on whether or not there is accountability, making your work that much more critical. And that if that accountability can't be achieved within these legal fora, that it be achieved, right, in a matter of public opinion. Otherwise, it becomes okay for all other countries to do the same thing in what would be characterized as asymmetric warfare. And so, anyway, my question had to do with the scary thing, Nadia, that you mentioned about even within the human rights bodies and the Human Rights Council, that they were seeing what Israel would characterize as complementarity, you know, its ability to conduct its own investigation as impeding the role of these UN bodies. That's Article 17 in the Rome Statute and relevant to the ICC, but it's scary if that is also relevant within the UN. So I'm just wondering, what is the political work that's being done in order to transcend this impasse beyond just demonstrating that it doesn't work? I mean, waiting for that might be waiting too long. And so what is the political work being done?
Great
to demonstrate
question.
that?
Great question. That's definitely what we found to be the most problematic piece, because there was such deference to Israeli investigative practices. So not only are we focusing on the failure of this new mechanism, but moving the complementarity piece historically, having historic depth to that question and demanding that the previous investigations also be taken into account, so that there's a general sense that the domestic mechanisms are designed to keep Palestinians out, and designed to, the idea too is that the system these aren't flaws necessarily in the system is designed precisely to deny accountability for Palestinians. So it's using kind of the whole of our experience, not only in the times of war or in response to military offensives, but also the strategy is demonstrating how the legal framework within Israel domestically is also being closed off in other ways. So it's not necessarily the military advocate general that's our main target, but also exposing how the Israeli Supreme Court is dismissing the cases, how refusing to engage, deciding not to decide on the most political, the most significant cases for civil, human, constitutional rights of Palestinians. So it's a broader strategy, because you're right, if we take it on the individual level, systems of oppression are really good at adapting to reform. So you'll say to Israel, well, you need to have a fact-finding assessment mechanism. They're like, sure, here's a fact-finding assessment mechanism, and this is how it works. And if we allow those small incremental pieces to be the way that we engage internationally, we'll find ourselves constantly in this same fight against the wall. So a system that is adapting to these small incremental changes. It's bigger.
I think we've run out of time, but I just want to say I found it so incredibly troubling that the advice you got from the international community is how to deal with the next military assault, as if it's a foregone conclusion. And so that really doesn't give me a whole lot of hope. But at the same time, it's important for you to be telling us this. It's important for you to be telling us everything you told us today. And really the hope I feel in all of it is that we have individuals like you working in this field and important organizations like DCI Palestine and Adalah and Damir and Mizan and Al-Haq and other Israeli organizations. And I hope that there are American-based, US-based organizations that are also working. I assume there are. What would some of those be? Like Amnesty International, what Human Rights Watch are?
For sure, the international human rights organizations are very involved. Amnesty, Human Rights Watch. I would, as far as what's happening domestically, Jewish Voice for Peace, the U.S. campaign to end the occupation, some of these also grassroots mobilizing arms that are really developing that movement and taking the advocacy to a new level. So I think these are a lot of our partners. The Institute for Middle East Understanding is doing great work, Just Vision. We have partners domestically. I think I would also encourage to have the Palestinian civil society come here, recognize that there's a space here. I think a lot of people are scared, or were scared, and now feeling that there's an opportunity to be here. And there are partners. The
That's
Jerusalem
great.
Fund.
Thank you.